Good evening. The show is the smoking section. Unfortunately, my guest tonight is unable to be here, and I will have to do the show by myself, which I am used to after many years of doing it, although it's always nice to have a guest, particularly Jamie the Vapor, who is very knowledgeable about at least electronic cigarette politics, nicotine, the way the public health officials and anti-smoking advocates have a tendency to, let's say, obfuscate the truth in their ideological campaign against tobacco and against electronic cigarettes. So I will just have to do it by myself, but there, as always, the tobacco issue is very, very big, and always something happening there. It really represents probably the government at its most intrusive. There is probably no way that government has actually affected the daily lives of people more than governments have vis-a-vis tobacco. For example, right here in this room now, it would be against state law for me to light a cigarette. Now, in the 80s, this would have been completely unbelievable that the government, that city and state and federal government, could possibly interfere on such a personal day-to-day basis with people's lives. Yet it has. And like many things, like the future is very difficult to predict, so we never know what is going to happen and what is going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years. That's why I'm always very confident to tell people, well, yes, the anti-smoking movement is in its ascendancy. It does have a great deal of momentum, but we don't know where it's going to be in 10 years. We don't know where it's going to be in 20 years. Eventually, the truth about tobacco will out, and I think many of these people who are running this movement and who are taking advantage and preying upon smokers and who are intoxicated with their own power will get their comeuppance. Now, yesterday there was a very large article in the New York Times about the United States Chambers of Commerce and how it has been advocating for tobacco companies throughout the world. And unfortunately, although I remember last week I was talking about the New York Times in a very nice way, this article I thought was extremely slanted, but it probably wasn't as slanted as it could have been. But there are some areas here that the tobacco companies have been extremely unfairly accused. And three of these areas were mentioned in this article. But first of all, one has to understand that there is the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is promulgated by the World Health Organization, is a treaty that is dedicated to the eradication of the tobacco industry and is dedicated to coercively and in any way possible reducing the opportunities for people to enjoy tobacco to the point where there will be a worldwide prohibition. And to do this, the promulgators of this treaty, the World Health Organization, will do just about anything. But one thing they have done is to vilify the tobacco companies. And this has always been a very, very, very good tactic on their part to create this image of these southern white men who are peddling this deadly killer. And for example, one thing that they have done is when tobacco sales in the United States did decline, the United States tobacco companies naturally shipped their product overseas, particularly to Asia. So what the anti-smokers pretended was that the tobacco companies were inveigling Asians to begin smoking and peddling their deadly product, as the anti-smokers like to frame it. But in point of fact, Asian countries have had extremely high smoking rates going back to before the Second World War. Japan has always had the very highest smoking rate of the entire industrialized world. Like in 1980, or excuse me, in the 50s, approximately 80% of Japanese men smoked. And even as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, at least 60% of Japanese men were smoking, and they had the highest average life expectancy, the world's lowest death rate from heart disease and very low rates of lung cancer. So the Japanese were smoking well before American tobacco companies began to send their product to Japan. China is actually the largest producer of tobacco in the world, has state monopolies on tobacco, has a very, very high smoking rate going back many, many, many decades. Likewise, Vietnam, Indonesia, all of these countries. What did happen is that in the, I guess it was the 80s or 90s, as the globalization phenomenon began to occur, there were a lot of international treaties, and the American tobacco companies were able to sell their product, let's say in a place like Japan, and Japan no longer could put the tremendous tariff on American cigarettes so that American cigarettes could sell in Japan. The market for tobacco in Japan did not increase. Likewise, the market in China, the market in Vietnam. It wasn't as if more Asians were smoking when the American companies started shipping their product overseas, but the anti-smokers framed it this way to make the American public think that the American tobacco companies were somehow getting Asians to smoke. And in this article yesterday in the Times about how the United States Chambers of Commerce advocates for American tobacco companies overseas, the entire article is kind of framed in this regard. So right now, there are a lot of international trade agreements, so that when a country enters into a trade agreement with another country or on a global basis, it loses some of its ability to regulate beyond what the treaty will allow. For example, New Zealand passed a law that the entire package, that there couldn't, that a tobacco package had to be completely in brown color, that the text of the product, the name of the brand, had to just be in black and white, and half of the pack was covered with gruesome pictures of diseased organs that were probably not even from smokers. And this was a major interference with a product and with the people who sell the product, the people who produce the product, and there are trade agreements that regulate this, and simply because New Zealand wanted to do this does not mean they have carte blanche to do it, because there are treaties, there are agreements that they have to adhere to, and even though they have public health advocates there who are intoxicated with their own power, this power is to some degree limited. And so the United States Chambers of Commerce does in fact assist different nations, or particularly when they are utilizing an American product, to fight against this encroachment, this intrusion by the government on a, let's say, when a customer or a consumer wants to buy a product and a business wants to sell it to them, there is, the government can interfere by saying, well, we're going to put such a tax on it that the consumer won't be able to afford it, and or we're going to force the company, in this case a tobacco company, to put such gruesome pictures on the package that this is going to repel the consumer. So the government is insinuating itself into what would normally be seen as a simple transaction between a consumer and a supplier or a provider. And again, the international treaties and whatnot somewhat limit the effect that governments can have on this. And it was interesting because I went to a talk at Boston University a couple of years ago, and there was an anti-smoking advocate from New Zealand, a really very abrasive woman, academic, and she was saying, well, New Zealand just wanted the tobacco companies to leave them alone, so that because the tobacco companies, under their rights, and probably with the help of the American Chambers of Commerce, was suing New Zealand regarding some of its draconian actions against the tobacco companies, and where they were doing it under the aegis of international treaties. So she was saying, well, New Zealand just wanted to be left alone. And I thought that was very ironic, because when she says she wants to be left alone, she and her other anti-smoking activists in the government and without, what they mean is they want to be left alone to harass and persecute smokers with high taxes and gruesome pictures on their products that they like, and restrictions everywhere where they can smoke. And they want to harass tobacco companies by saying, oh, you can't create a product, or you can't put it in a package. So I thought that was very ironic. She wanted to be left alone so that she could persecute consumers and the corporations that were supplying consumers with what they wanted, namely the tobacco companies. But of course, this article in the Times yesterday really had a very, very big slant, which I thought was very noticeable, but at the same time rather interesting. But still, it always pits the tobacco companies as the bad guys and public health officials and anti-smoking activists as the good guys. And I think that is very biased reporting. There was a letter to the editor in the New York Times which essentially said, it was referring to global warming, people who are skeptical of global warming. And this particular letter said that, well, people who are skeptical of global warming are really similar to the tobacco companies, who knew that their product was killing people, but they didn't want to let that interfere with their sales, so tobacco companies disputed what was said about them. And this has been kind of a pattern or a template that anti-smoking or global warming people have used. Anytime a company or an industry disputes what is said about it, that company is said to be denying or muddying the waters, even though there is a lot of scientific controversy that the public may not be aware of. And this was exactly the case in the 50s and even into the 60s and even into the 70s, where there were many biostatisticians, medical people, and others who were very, very skeptical of the science that was being touted and used against the tobacco companies. But for whatever reason, the anti-smoking warriors were able to get more press. They were very, very unprincipled. They would attack viciously anyone, no matter how good his or her reputation was or his credentials were, they would attack viciously and accuse them of being in cahoots with the tobacco industry. So they had no compunction at all about using vicious ad hominem attacks against even some of the most important people in the medical research profession. But so they got the upper hand, and but in that era particularly, there was indeed controversy. The tobacco companies did not know that tobacco was harmful or believe that tobacco was harmful and lie about it to the public by any means. There may have been people in the tobacco companies who believe that, but the tobacco companies very legitimately questioned and challenged a lot of the putative science that was being used against them. But the narrative has been changed quite a bit, and so they are used as a kind of a like a template, like anytime an industry defends itself against its accusers, they're said to be, oh, the tobacco companies knew tobacco was bad, yet they disputed the science. So without looking at the criticisms that the tobacco companies made of the science, or without looking at the methodology of the science, you simply say, well, the tobacco companies are bad guys, all they care about is a profit, and the public health people and the anti-smoking scientists are all good people. And I think that's really something that people should kind of try to question more. Question authority is something that we used to say, and I think it's very important now, and I think people should particularly question scientific authority, because there is no other authority that we have that claims the kind of infallibility that scientific authority does. People at MIT, people at Harvard, when anybody who questions them, they accuse of being anti-science, and they claim such authority that I think we should, more even than religious authority, at least a religious authority does not say, well, we believe in critical judgment, or critical thinking, and now accept everything I say, and if you don't, you're anti-science. At least religious authority doesn't claim to have its authority coming from critical thinking or evidence. It claims it from faith, whereas scientific authority says it's evidence-based, when very often it's not, and it uses ad hominem attacks against people who question it. Well, I think I'll go to the Smoker of the Week right now. It's that time of the show, and he has been on before. He is actually, I believe, a hero in Ireland, and I think there is a beer named after him right now, and his name is, oops, I think I got the wrong guy. But anyway, this man is a different person I was thinking of, but this man is similar. He was a polar explorer, and he was on the Shackleton's expedition to the South Pole, and his name was John Vincent. And in the book, The Endurance, Shackleton's legendary Antarctic expedition, 1999, the author writes, John Vincent was the strongest man on the Endurance. Shackleton wanted him on the Caird for his strength and seamanship. And I don't know if you can really see it or not, but he has a cigarette in his mouth. And this was in about 1910 when Shackleton went, or 1914, he was trying to cross the South Pole. And one of the most important supplies that his men had was tobacco. Everyone smoked. They smoked cigarettes, pipes, cigars, and it was having tobacco, in my opinion, that helped them to endure the kinds of cold hardships, such as cold, lack of food, lack of entertainment, all of these things, and also was able to make men in a ship, a very small ship, a wooden ship, which was locked in the ice for a year. It made them able to deal with other men and not go crazy, not their frustration and all of those things, their peevishness was somehow reduced by tobacco. And then Shackleton did what is considered to be one of the greatest feats of survival is he rowed a boat with about 4 other men 850 miles in a very, very high sea to get help for the men when the expedition became hopelessly locked in the ice. And again, actually, this is from another book. This is actually from another book, and it says that as Shackleton was in the stern of this boat, this very small boat going in the sea, from time to time he would roll cigarettes, and he and Vincent would smoke them and talk of many things. So I think that is interesting that in most of the books I've read in polar exploration, tobacco has been one of the ways that they could deal with that harsh environment and also deal with each other in that it reduced their frustration, their anger, that type of thing. And any book on polar exploration, you will see that tobacco is a necessity. Today in the Globe, it talks about the Massachusetts Senate is thinking about raising the taxes on, let's see, what have we here? Flavored cigars, flavored smoking tobacco, flavored smoking tobacco, and flavored blunt wraps. Well, I don't know what a blunt wrap is, but it's very interesting because it mentions that the tax on a cigar in Massachusetts is 40%, and they want to raise the tax to 210%. And this tax will be hidden from the consumer. It will not be at a point of sale tax. So that, for example, if Levitt and Pierce, our good friend Paul McDonald, wants to buy a cigar from a distributor, and the distributor wants to charge $1 for that cigar to pay for his expenses and maybe even eke out a little profit, he will then have to put on $2.10 to the price. So he wants to sell a cigar to Paul for $1. He has to sell it to Paul for $3.10. And then, of course, Paul has to sell it to the consumer, but the consumer doesn't realize that the state has put a $2.10 tax on a $1 cigar. And then to add insult to injury, when Paul sells that at Levitt and Pierce in Harvard Square, then he has to put a 6.25% sales tax on top of that. You know, if this isn't tyrannical and predatory, I don't know what is. And that the Massachusetts public can allow this to happen, and that smokers allow this to happen to them, is really almost a crime in itself, to allow yourself to be so bamboozled by the government. The senator who is mostly in charge of this is a man named Lewis, Senator Lewis, who is a Democrat of Winchester. And this article, which is actually very informative, goes on to say that smokeless tobacco is already taxed at 210%. That's the Massachusetts tax. There might be a federal tax on it, and then, of course, there's a sale tax on it. What is very, very, very heartening in this is House Speaker Robert DeLeo is not in favor of increasing taxes, and Charlie Baker also is not in favor of increasing taxes, even taxes on tobacco. God bless them. You know, it's really something that at least Robert DeLeo, who is a Democrat, and Charlie Baker, who's a Republican, are at least against this. But I hope to have more information for you probably in our next program, which Emily Ouija will be hosting. And we will have Jeffrey Alanesian from Brennan's Smoke Shops. I'm sure he will know a great deal more about this than I do. But the Boston Globe article today was very, very informative. Well, we've come to the end of the show. Thank you for watching the smoking section. A few more seconds to go. Please go to our Facebook page. Contact us any way you can.